Hello everyone, Mr. B here. So as I mentioned last week, we are actually going to very briefly cover chapter 12, which has to do with social psychology. Usually this isn't covered in Introduction to Psychology because social psychology is such a huge field, it's such a huge important part of psychology, gets its own class. But I wanted to at least talk about a few of the kind of big experiments and the big kind of findings in social psychology, and kind of briefly what social psychology is. So we're going to get right into it. So when we talk about social psychology, what we mean is it's a scientific study of how a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors influence and are influenced by social groups. So it's essentially just saying how we affect other people and how other people affect us. And it is huge. A lot of times we like to have this idea that we are individuals, we are in control of our own actions, our own thoughts, our own feelings. But research would say otherwise, and sometimes in very scary ways. And so the very first thing that we talk about is conformity. And this is when you change your own behavior voluntarily in order to match what other people are doing. So, you see everybody else standing in line, waiting at a door. You're not just going to walk up to that door and try it, you're going to wait in line as well. You're going to conform, because everyone is standing in line. That's what we mean by conformity. You're changing your behavior, you're behaving like everybody else. Voluntarily, you are choosing to do this because it's what everyone else is doing. And there have been a lot of studies out there, numbers are a little off, that look into conformity and just how strong it is and how many people it takes to conform. And one of the most commonly known experiments out there is the Solomon-Asch study. And I'm going to go over it very quickly. Again, there's a whole class that goes over this. I wish I could go in more detail because this is so important, but I'm going to go through it quickly. And essentially the way that this study was done is a participant was in a room with a bunch of other people that were in on the study, and they were in a sense, I don't want to say lied to, but they believed that the point of the study was looking at perspective. And so they would be shown this standard line, and they would have to say which of the three lines looked the most similar, or was the roughly same length as the first one. So, if you look at this, it is very easy to see that this middle line is the one that's the most common in length to the standard line. And so they would go around the room and they'd say, okay, which comparison line is the most common, 1, 2, or 3, and they would just go through and record everyone's scores. What they found is that if you had 4 confederates, or 4 individuals that were kind of in on the gag, that gave the same incorrect answer, the majority of the time, the subject would also give the wrong answer. Even though, again, when you look at this, it is very clear what the right answer is. But when, and again, that magic number, about 4 people give the same wrong answer, there's just something that goes on where suddenly we start to think like, oh, they must know something I don't, maybe I'm not seeing something that's there, and you conform. Because if there is something you take from social psychology, and especially this idea of conformity, it's that it is not a good feeling to be the odd one out. It is not a good feeling to be doing something different than what everyone else is doing. It's very hard, and it's very easy to conform. But what research also found is that if you had just one person, one confederate, one person that was, again, in on the experiment, to give the right answer, it greatly decreased conformity. So, while it's scary to see how easy it is for individuals to conform, it's also very easy to break. It takes that one person, because then all of a sudden, the individual doesn't feel like they're alone. They don't think, oh, something must be going on, and I'll just do what everyone else is doing. Suddenly there's this thought of, oh, there's someone else out there that feels the same way as me. Therefore, it validates, your thoughts, your feelings, your behavior. So one thing that I always say, and every once in a while. I can bring myself back and say something very quickly. A thing to take away from this for conformity: be that one person. If you're in a situation and everyone else is doing something that you know is wrong, as long as it does not impact your safety, do what you feel is right. Be that one person, because you would be surprised how many people in that room or in that situation feel the same way, but they just need that one person to not conform, and then it breaks all of the conformity. So conformity is a very, very strong thing. It can get very dangerous very quickly. So be that one person. And speaking of that one person, it goes into this idea of groupthink, when there isn't that one person. So groupthink happens when everyone is conforming to the group decision in order to avoid being that outcast. Because again, it's not easy to be the person that goes against what everybody else wants or what everyone else is doing. It's not easy. But it's such an important thing to play the devil's advocate. Unfortunately, there's this kind of negative connotation to those that play the devil advocate. You know, you go out and you're partying with your friends, and everybody wants to do one thing, and you know it's wrong, and so you say, I don't know, this doesn't seem right. And everyone's like, oh, you know, don't be a killjoy. Like, it doesn't feel good, but it's the right thing to do, because when you don't have that, when you fall for groupthink, and everyone in the group is scared to do something that goes against the group, people can get hurt. Also, when you have this idea of groupthink, a lot of times it leads to this mentality of, if you're not with us, you're against us. And this whole idea of, oh, if you're going to go against the group, you know, then you don't like the group. You're not a part of the group. And that's not true. Any group out there should always have at least one person that will, you know, think about it, consider the other side, try to play the devil's advocate, because it can help to prevent some very disastrous things from happening. When we take conformity a step further, and it is individuals that, again, voluntarily are conforming, they're behaving a certain way, voluntarily, when it's because of perceived authority, so feeling like, you know, there's someone in a sense of power telling you to do it, and therefore you choose to do it, this is what we call obedience. And there was a very controversial experiment, which I'm about to go into, that looked into obedience because of the Nuremberg trials. And so this is Adolf Eichmann. He was one of the higher-ups in the Nazi regime, or just of the Nazis. And so he was one of the ones that, you know, was sending tons of people to gas chambers, knowing perfectly well what was going to happen to them, that they were going to be killed, they were going to be murdered. And he willingly did it. And so when the war was over, and there were war crimes and he was brought in, he said, you know, I was just following orders. You know, I did nothing wrong. I was just doing what the higher-ups were telling me to do. If I didn't do it, someone else was going to do it, and, you know, I was going to get in trouble and possibly killed if I didn't do it. So it didn't make any sense for me not to follow the orders. And this caused a lot of controversy. And there were individuals that said, like, oh, you know, that's Nazis. You know, Nazis are evil people. Other people wouldn't do this. They know, you know, that killing is wrong. And so even if, you know, there's this perceived authority, surely people wouldn't perceivably kill people just because someone told them to. And so an experiment was made to look into this. And this is the Milgram's obedience experiment. And again, I'm going to go over it relatively quickly. There's some video footage of the actual Milgram obedience study that I will be including. But essentially, the participant had the role of a teacher. Their job was teaching the learner word pairs. So, you know, let's say that fast was paired with train. That's not the most important thing for the experiment, but they were teaching the learner. If the learner got the question wrong, they would get a mild electric shock. And every time that the learner got an electric shock, the voltage of the shock would then go up more. It would be more intense, a higher voltage each time. What the participant didn't know, what the teacher didn't know, is that they weren't actually shocking someone. So no one was getting hurt. But the participant didn't know that. From the participant's point of view, they were shocking someone whenever they got a question wrong and slowly increasing the voltage. So that's important to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind, and also, I mean, you can kind of see it on the picture, there was a wall, so they couldn't see the learner, because again, he wasn't actually being shocked. But there was a tape player that was playing certain responses. Another thing is that there was an experimenter in the room. And, well, I'll get into it, but essentially the experimenter never forced the teacher to continue, never forced the teacher to, give the shock. It was always voluntary. And so the whole idea was, how far will people go? How far will, from their point of view, because again, they didn't realize that they weren't shocking someone, how much would you shock someone willingly just because you're essentially asked to or told to? So again, this idea of obedience. And this was what the shocker looked like. So again, it's kind of hard to see. But you would start way down here with this switch, and every time that they would get it wrong, you'd move it up more and more and more. And as you would see, and again, it's so hard to see on this, so I apologize, certain voltages were labeled. And so it went from black print then to red print, where it would say stuff like intense shock, extreme intense shock, danger extreme shock, and then XXX. And it's one of those things where, if you go all the way up here, you know that that is a huge shock. Like, that is potentially life-threatening shock with the XXX. And the only thing that the experimenter in the room would say, because again, it was voluntary, the experimenter would say, like, please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. It's never forcing the participant to continue, but, adding a little bit of pressure. And as I said, the quote-unquote learner, the person that the participant thought they were shocking, had certain recorded responses that they would hear back after a certain shock. So at 120, they would say, ouch, experimenter, let me out of here, I'm through, please, I have heart troubles, I don't want to go on. At 150, they say, that's enough, I will not be part of this experiment, let me out now. At 300 volts, there'd be a scream of pain, and it's like, I'm not doing this anymore, you can't make me stay here, get me out, get me out. And then finally at 330, there'd be an even louder scream of pain, and then get me out, my heart, my chest hurts, get me out of here, let me out. You get the idea. So every single subject would always hear this response at these voltages. And at one point, the, again, learner would go silent. So all of a sudden there would not be a response. And the experimenter would say, treat no response as a wrong answer, still give the shock, still continue. And so the whole point of this experiment was to see how far would people go. Would they give that lethal shock to someone that's no longer responding, which again can be perceived as, the person passed out, or, some people perceived it as that person was dead. They said that their chest was hurting, and then all of a sudden they go silent, and they're still being given electric shocks. How far would people go? And when we look at this graph, the green is the predicted, what we thought would happen with compliance. And so the whole idea was that, right around 150, when you started to hear those responses, it would drop down and, no one would go all the way to the end. But as you can see, the blue line is what actually happened. And another way to view this is 65% obeyed all the way to the end, all the way to that extreme shock. And you can now see it breaks it down further for what percentages stopped at what voltage. So you have the 300, 315, 330. Again, all of these were its intense shock, extreme intense. And this horrified people because it showed that it wasn't that, there was something fundamentally different about Nazis or, Germans or anything like that. It seemed to be in human nature that if there is someone of perceived authority that is strongly, again, not even forcing you to do it, strongly advising that you do something, even if it could perceivably kill someone, a lot of people will do it. A lot of people will obey. And this is scary. It's something that people don't want to think. And even interviewed, I can bring myself back, even interviewed, when you ask people, like, would you kill someone just because someone tells you to do it, someone of authority tells you to do it? A lot of people would say no. Like, of course not. Killing is wrong. And I've asked this in previous classes, and I have gotten people to say, it's like, well, it depends on the person. Like, is this, a murderer, and I'm being asked to take this person out before they kill other people? But when I specify, and I'm like, no, just a random person, and you're being told to shock this person to death, most people would say, no, I wouldn't do that. But the research says otherwise, and it's a harsh reality. And other people said in the past that, this was research that was done right after a war. We aren't like that anymore. But I can tell you that this study was replicated. And it was actually, if I recall correctly, it was 75% this time would obey all the way to the end. So if anything, it increased for this level of obeying. So this is one of the research that's out there that, again, it's very controversial. It caused a lot of emotional distress. Like, if you see the actual footage, it's not that these people were just sitting here saying, ooh, I'm going to shock this person. Whoops, I might have killed him. No. They were under a huge amount of distress, and you can see it in the video where, they're struggling, where, like, this person is strongly advising them to do something, but they feel like, they're hurting this person. So they're constantly fighting against themselves, and, there's this inner turmoil. But at the end of the day, the majority of them went all the way to the end with that. From what they perceived, again, no one was actually shocked, but from what they perceived, they went all the way. And it was alarming. But it's something that I think that everyone should be aware of, that this can happen, but being more aware of it makes it less likely to happen, which is why I always want to talk about it in this class. But anyway, sorry, I'll continue going. Well, actually, no, I won't, because that's all that I wanted to do for this video. And again, the thing to take away from this, when it comes to conformity, when it comes to obedience, obviously obeying and conformity has its place. We all conform to the rules on the road. We all stop at the red light. We all do, we conform to that. Conformity is good. There's a lot of things out there that everyone should be following it for our own safety. But there are so many instances when, we start to feel uncomfortable, when everyone around us is doing something that we don't believe in or we don't want to do. And it is so hard to be that person to stand up and say no. But we need those people, because the majority of the time, you're not the only one that feels that way. You're not the only one that has that feeling of like, this isn't right, I don't want to do this. And so if you can break that mold and be that person to say, no, this is wrong, a lot of times you'd be surprised how many other people will suddenly back you up. That being said, if ever you are in a situation where you could be in danger, unfortunately sometimes conformity, again, also has its place. But if you're in a situation, like if you're with your friends and you really don't feel like what's going on is right, speak up about it. Because sometimes if you don't speak up about it and you go along with it with groupthink, the results can be disastrous. And sometimes it can be a matter of life and death, and it's not worth it. So be that person, and be aware that even if you feel like you're that person, when you're finally faced in that situation, it's tough. But hopefully, seeing the research that's out there, seeing that when you become that person that breaks that mold, that breaks that conformity, that other people will follow. Hopefully that will help. But it's getting too long. We will be back to talk about attitudes.